This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is about a system quietly discovering that its safeguards may no longer work. Not because they were removed, but because they were ignored long enough to feel optional. What's unfolding right now didn't arrive with sirens. It arrived with procedures, with routine language, with authority exercised just far enough to test whether anyone would stop it. And for the first time in a long time, someone did, not loudly, not heroically, but deliberately. That moment matters more than it looks like it should. Because once a system learns it can act without consequence, it doesn't rush. It accelerates slowly, carefully, until reversal becomes impossible. If you think this is just another political clash, stay with me. Because what's actually being tested isn't a policy. It's a boundary. And once boundaries start to blur, the damage doesn't announce itself. It compounds. That's where this story really begins. What actually controls the system right now isn't ideology. It isn't party. It isn't even elections. It's leverage. Leverage created by speed, by surprise, by acting faster than oversight can organize. In theory, this system runs on checks and balances. In practice, it runs on who moves first and who hesitates, who declares urgency, who frames action as inevitable. When authority is exercised as momentum, resistance becomes reactive. And reactive institutions always lose ground. This is why personalities don't matter as much as posture. The posture that treats rules as obstacles, that treats process as delay, that treats consent as optional. Once that posture takes hold, the system doesn't collapse. It adapts around it. Procedures bend. Language softens. Exceptions multiply. And here's the quiet danger. Every time the system absorbs one exception without consequence, it rewrites its own limits. Not officially, culturally, what you're watching isn't defiance. It's a recalibration of who the system actually answers to now. And that shift didn't happen overnight. It took years, which is exactly why the next part matters. The most dangerous change didn't happen all at once. It happened slowly enough to feel reasonable. There was a time when extraordinary power required extraordinary moments. Clear threats, defined limits, avisible. Now, urgency is ambient, always present, always implied. What used to be rare is now procedural. What used to require explanation now arrives pre-justified, labeled as necessary, framed as responsible. Before, institutions debated first and acted second. Now they act, then explain later, if at all. This shift matters because systems don't fail when they're attacked. They fail when their defenses are repurposed as conveniences. Each small normalization teaches the system a lesson. That speed beats deliberation. That force beats consent. That consequences can be negotiated after the fact. And here's the part that's easy to miss. Nothing looks broken while this is happening. Everything still works. Votes still happen. Statements still get issued, but the meaning underneath them changes. What once slowed power now clears a path for it. And once that path exists, it doesn't stay unused for long. That's when the first real shock arrives. Then the system flinched. Not in theory, not in commentary. In recorded votes, a formal mechanism, rarely used and usually ignored, was pulled off the shelf and activated. Not to make a point, to stop something. It wasn't framed as punishment. It wasn't framed as rebellion. It was framed as restraint. That alone tells you how far things had drifted. Because this tool exists for moments when the cost of silence is higher than the cost of confrontation. When delay itself becomes a risk. When waiting feels irresponsible. The move was precise, narrow, targeted, and that's what made it alarming. This wasn't outrage spilling over. It was calculation. The response came fast. Personal, furious. Pressure applied where it always is. Loyalty invoked, consequences implied. And yet something unexpected happened. The pressure didn't reverse the action. If that surprises you, pay attention. Because systems don't resist power unless they believe something worse is coming. And this intervention wasn't about what already happened. It was about what might happen next. That's the part we haven't talked about yet. Here's how the system actually works when it starts to slip. Power doesn't move in one direction. It redistributes risk. At the center, decisions get faster, cleaner, less encumbered. On the outside, uncertainty spreads. Responsibility blurs. Consequences diffuse downward. The people who benefit are rarely visible. They operate where discretion lives. Inside exceptions, inside emergencies, inside moments labeled too urgent for debate. The damage, meanwhile, is absorbed quietly by institutions forced to react instead of govern, by alliances asked to trust signals that keep changing, by citizens who inherit outcomes they never consented to. Emergency authority is the key accelerant here because it does something subtle and powerful. It converts choice into necessity. Once something is labeled urgent, disagreement becomes obstruction. Oversight becomes delay. And restraint starts to look irresponsible. That's how the mechanism sustains itself. Not through domination, through framing. And once framed that way, resistance has to justify itself over and over again. Power doesn't, which means the longer this runs, the more asymmetric the system becomes. Those at the center accumulate freedom. Everyone else absorbs volatility. And volatility doesn't announce itself as failure. It announces itself as the next crisis, which is already forming. Then it started stacking. One move on its own could be debated. Two could be explained. Three begin to look like a pattern. Urgency followed urgency. Authority followed authority. No pause. No reset. Each action justified the next. Each exception lowered the bar for the one after it. Oversight tried to keep up. It couldn't. Questions arrived after decisions. Reviews trailed consequences. Timelines slipped. Meanwhile, attention was redirected outward, louder, bigger. When scrutiny tightened in one place, pressure surfaced somewhere else. A new front, a new risk, a new distraction. This isn't chaos. It's load management. Flood the system faster than it can respond. Force institutions to triage. Make restraint compete with spectacle. And here's the critical shift. At this speed, even good faith actors start choosing which norms to enforce and which to ignore. Not because they want to, because they have to. That's when systems cross a line. Not when rules are broken. When they're selectively applied, and once that happens, the next escalation doesn't feel like a choice. It feels inevitable. Here's where this reaches you. Because when systems tilt, they don't land on abstractions. They land on daily life. You feel it as instability before you recognize it as policy. Plans get harder to make. Costs get harder to predict. The future feels conditional. You're told this is happening somewhere above you, somewhere technical, somewhere you don't need to worry about. But you already are. When power moves faster than accountability, markets react. Employers hesitate. Investments pause. Prices absorb risk long before wages do. And you're left adjusting. Again, you were promised restraint, predictability, a system that knew the difference between strength and impulse. Instead, you're watching rules stretch in real time and being asked to trust that they'll snap back later. They rarely do. If this feels familiar, that's because you've lived through versions of it before. Moments when temporary became permanent. When exceptions became expectations. If you want to understand what's really happening and what comes next, stay with me. Because the next shift doesn't stop at national borders. And once it moves outward, it's harder to contain. Once instability leaves home, it doesn't travel alone. Systems abroad don't wait for explanations. They respond to signals. When commitments sound conditional, partners start recalculating. Quietly, privately, immediately. Contingency plans get dusted off. Assumptions get rewritten. Trust, once questioned, stops compounding. This is how local posture becomes global consequence. Alliances aren't contracts. They're expectations reinforced over time. And when those expectations wobble, everyone hedges. Not dramatically, incrementally. Intelligent sharing becomes cautious. Coordination slows. Fallback options appear where none existed before. And adversaries notice they don't need chaos. They need ambiguity. Ambiguity creates openings, narratives spread, influence shifts without a single shot fired. What's dangerous here isn't confrontation. It's doubt. Doubt about whether commitments hold under pressure, about whether rules mean the same thing tomorrow as they did yesterday. Once that doubt takes root, it doesn't stay contained to one region or one issue. It ripples. And when ripples start intersecting, the system doesn't break loudly. It drifts. Which brings us to the hardest question: what happens next if nothing interrupts this momentum? From here, the system has three possible directions. Not outcomes, trajectories. The first is adjustment. Institutions reassert themselves just enough to slow the momentum. Oversight regains footing. Limits are enforced selectively but visibly. The system bends, absorbs the stress, and survives changed but intact. This path requires discipline and patience, and actors willing to endure pressure without flinching. The second is erosion. Nothing dramatic breaks. Everything just weakens. Checks exist, but they hesitate. Rules apply, but unevenly. Power keeps its speed, and accountability keeps lagging behind. Life goes on. So does volatility. This is the most comfortable path and the most dangerous because it feels manageable right up until it isn't. The third is rupture, a moment where accumulated exceptions collide with a real shock, a miscalculation, a misread signal, a crisis that can't be narrated away. At that point, institutions don't get to deliberate. They react. And reaction under strain rarely favors restraint. Which path emerges doesn't depend on intent. It depends on resistance. And that question is still unresolved because the next move hasn't happened yet. What happens next won't announce itself as a turning point. It will look procedural, routine, justified. That's how systems change without triggering alarms. The danger isn't that power is being used. It's that the rules governing its use are being treated as flexible, conditional, negotiable under pressure. Once that mindset settles in, it doesn't matter who holds authority next. The tools remain, the precedents stay. The shortcuts wait, and history doesn't rewind to fix that later. You're being told this is noisy, chaotic, temporary. It isn't. This is a quiet test of whether limits still mean what we think they mean, whether institutions still slow power or merely document it after the fact. There's no resolution here, no reassurance, only a warning written in real time. If you stop paying attention, the system won't pause with you. It will keep adapting, so keep watching. Keep tracking what gets normalized. Keep asking which boundaries still hold and which ones don't, because the most important consequences of this moment haven't arrived yet. They're being prepared. If you want to understand what comes after this and how close we are to the edge, stay with me. The next chapter doesn't make noise when it begins, and that's exactly why it matters.